Peace be with you. Friends, for this week, I'm going to preach on our second reading. I don't do that all that often, but very powerful today. It's from Paul's second letter to Timothy. Scholars are divided about whether Paul himself actually wrote this letter. It was kind of customary in the ancient world sometimes to write something and then claim, a famous person as the author. And there's evidence on both sides of this. I've always been persuaded that Paul did indeed write it. At any rate, it's filled with Paul's spirit. It's written from prison. Paul spent a lot of time in prison. As I've said before, when you declared the lordship of Jesus in the ancient world, you were not just trading in bland spiritual speech. You were making a subversive claim because Caesar was Lord. You're claiming, no, not Caesar, but Jesus is Lord. You're upsetting all the social political conventions of the time. Therefore, it's not surprising that Paul spent a lot of time in prison. From prison, he writes to Timothy, and there's something very charming because Timothy is a much younger man, and there's something of a mentor-mentee, master-disciple relationship between Paul and Timothy. And the fact that Timothy was part Jewish, part Gentile just adds to the charm because, of course, Paul, the Jew who was born in Gentile territory and whose whole mission was to bring the God of Israel to the nations, in a way, Timothy kind of symbolizes that dual nature of Paul. There's something of, call it an old soldier giving advice to a young soldier. I'm using that image on purpose because Paul often saw the spiritual life in these sort of military terms of a struggle, of a battle, of a conquest. Listen now to what he says to Timothy. I remind you to stir into flame the gift of God bestowed when my hands were laid on you. The spirit God has given us is no cowardly spirit, but rather one that makes us strong, loving, and wise. There's so much to unpack there. Stir into flame the gift of God bestowed when my hands were laid upon you. As I record these words, just a few weeks ago, I had the enormous privilege as a bishop to ordain young men to the priesthood, and it's done through this gesture of the laying on of hands. And I've had the privilege of doing that now a number of times, and whenever I have, in my mind, I go right back to these earliest days. This was the gesture by which the power of ordination was passed on. So Paul reminds Timothy of when he ordained him. And then he tells him, the spirit that you should stir into flame is no cowardly spirit. This is soldier to soldier. The implication is there's going to be something of a battle. You've got to have courage to face down the enemies you will face down. You've got to be able to stand strong. But know something, please. It's no cowardly spirit, but makes us strong, loving, and wise. He's not telling Timothy he should be a soldier in the ordinary sense. He's not telling him to attach his courage to the weapons of the world. No, rather to wisdom and to love. And there you've got the gospel, everybody. When one stands courageously with wisdom, with love, with all the gifts of the Holy Spirit, then one is able to face down the powers of the world. When we try to fight them on their own terms, we try to conquer evil with evil, we make no progress toward the kingdom of God. But when this courageous spirit is stirred up and coupled with wisdom and love, now we make a difference. Now we move toward the kingdom. Now, with that in mind, and this, especially that phrase that we have received no cowardly spirit, can I rehearse for you the story of Father Jerzy Papawuszko? Now, maybe not a household name, but he should be. One of the great heroes, really, of the 20th century. Father Jerzy distinguished himself in the early years of the 1980s during the solidarity struggle in Poland. When he was a seminarian, he was not a star. Sometimes you see a guy in the seminary and say, boy, he's got gifts of, mind and compassion and pastoral skill, and boy, that guy's going to really make a mark. Well, Father Jerzy wasn't like that in the seminary, frankly. He was known as quiet and prayerful, but a little bit unsure of himself, a little on the mousy side. Probably nobody in the seminary would have chosen him for great things. After his ordination, he becomes an associate pastor in a parish in Gdansk. And Gdansk, as you remember, is the city where the Solidarity movement really was born. So I remember those times very well. I was a young guy, I was about 20 years old, when, largely under the inspiration of John Paul II, who had come to Poland in 1979, stood there in Victory Square in Warsaw, and there in the presence of the Polish government, and implicitly behind them the whole Soviet government, John Paul, with no tanks or no army, no guns, began to speak these great truths about God, about the spiritual life, about the dignity of human beings, about human rights. Remember, the people began to chant, "We want God, we want God, we want God." And a social revolution, as well as a religious one, was unleashed that day. Well, it took more concrete political form in the so-called Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. And Gdansk is where it started. You remember, here's another name, maybe it's faded away a bit, but Lech Wałęsa, who was a kind of a union organizer, dock worker, and he becomes the leader of this Solidarity movement. Well, Father Jerzy was there in Gdansk as a young priest when all of this ferment was going on. Now, they certainly had their political leader in Wałęsa, and they had, if you want, a long-distance spiritual leader in John Paul II. But I think what the people were looking for was someone on the ground who provide for them spiritual leadership. And I think to everyone's surprise, they found it in this mousy young priest who suddenly began, from his parish church, to preach these powerful sermons, very much in the spirit of John Paul II, invoking the power of God, reminding people of human dignity, speaking against attempts to oppress, speaking in favor of human rights. And it galvanized the crowds. They came first in small numbers, then they came in greater numbers, and finally they filled the church and they overflowed outside so that his sermons were carried on loud speakers to great crowds around the church. One thing Father Jerzy insisted upon was the power of nonviolence. Not to oppose their oppressors with the violent weapons of the world, the violent strategies of the world, but rather to walk with what Gandhi would have called soul force, the power of the spirit, the power of nonviolent resistance. He gave the people a way to fight, and they learned from him. Well, as was the case with Oscar Romero in El Salvador, the sermons of Jerzy Papawuszko came to the attention of the government. They knew that he was a powerful opponent. They knew precisely because of his style of preaching and the content of his message that he was particularly dangerous. If he had been a straightforward, violent revolutionary, they could have just dealt with him. But they knew he was particularly dangerous. And so, at the height of his popularity, one night he was kidnapped by officers of the government. He was trussed up, he was beaten repeatedly, and eventually he was dumped in the river and drowned. So this vibrant young man, this spiritual leader, put to death by his opponents. When Paul laid his hands on Timothy, he stirred up in him a spirit that was no cowardly spirit, a spirit enabling Timothy to stand, yes, against the powers of the world. Not in violence, not using the weapons of the world, but precisely in wisdom and in love. There was Jerzy Papawuszko. For several days, the people of his parish prayed that he was missing. They didn't know where he was. They feared the worst, but they prayed. Eventually, his body was discovered. And some feared, well, this will overflow now into great violence. The people will be so angry, they will rise up violently against the government. It didn't happen. You know why? Because the people had taken in the lessons of Father Jerzy's sermons. They rose up, not in violence, but in prayer and in soul force. And there's no question, John Paul II, of course, is an animating spirit behind the Solidarity movement. But Father Jerzy Popowuszko, in death, became also a very powerful spiritual force. It led eventually to massive change within Poland, and I think it's no exaggeration to say it led in time to the breakup of the Soviet Union. These spiritual figures, through soul force, having in them no cowardly spirit, effected massive social change. Let me close with this story. This goes back to that same era. I was a seminarian at the time. I would have been at Mundelein Seminary in like maybe second or third year. And to the seminary one night came the man who actually confirmed me when I was in sixth grade, Bishop Alfred Abramovich. He was an auxiliary of Chicago. He had been a good friend of John Paul II. He was active in smuggling things into Poland during the worst of the communist period. Anyway, there we were, and we were pretty comfortable, mostly middle class, kids from the city or suburbs of Chicago, doing our seminary studies, but, living a fairly easy, comfortable life. But I remember that night after dinner, Bishop Abramovich got up, and he spoke to us of Jerzy Popowuszko, and none of us at the time knew this story. And you could hear a pin drop in the room as we took in this extraordinary story about a man who wasn't a lot older than we were at the time and who gave his life in witness to the gospel, that he experienced stirred up in him the same spirit we were anticipating to be stirred up in us at our ordination. Well, we were so impressed. To this day, I remember that evening. There was a little group of us who formed a prayer group around Jerzy Popowuszko, praying for his intercession. And even today, as I stand here many years later, filled and stirred up by his spirit, by his example. Listen to Paul, and I'll close with this as he speaks to Timothy. Therefore, never be ashamed of your testimony to our Lord, nor of me, a prisoner for his sake. But with the strength that comes from God, bear your share of the hardship which the gospel entails. So it goes, everybody, up and down the centuries for 2,000 years. We do stand against a sinful world. We stand athwart a world predicated upon violence and hatred and cruelty and injustice. Therefore, there is in us no cowardly spirit. But don't tie that spirit to the weapons of the world. Tie that spirit to wisdom and to love. And you will take steps toward the kingdom of God. Peace be with you. Friends, last week we had a wonderful portrait of discipleship. You might say the cost of discipleship was on clear display. As we continue now our reading of the Gospel of Luke, we have today a great, I would say, portrait of the church. What the church looks like, what its central concerns are, what the demands upon it are. And the setting is Jesus sending out 72 disciples. So just put yourself in that position. So all of us baptized people are disciples of the Lord, and we're in this relationship with him. He's going to send us out. So let's just kind of walk through this passage. It'll teach us very important lessons about the church. So we hear, the Lord appointed a further 72, sent them in pairs before him to every town and place he intended to visit. First, we learn we are a missionary church. Christianity is not so much a quiet, sit-in-place spirituality. There's room for the whole monastic contemplative dimension. Of course there is. But the basic thrust of Christianity is toward mission. Mittere in Latin, to send, and mission just comes from that word. We are sent out. The gospel is not for us simply to savor for our own edification. We can and we should, but then the impetus, the trajectory is always toward sharing it. Now, I've said this many times, but I think for a lot of the ordinary baptized, they don't think of it that way. They think, yeah, I'll go to Mass and I'll receive the sacraments and I'll try to be a decent person, but I'm not a missionary. I'm not like a a priest or a bishop or a sister or a professional missionary. Well, you might not be crossing the ocean. But yes, as a baptized person, you're like one of these 72. You've been sent on mission. See, what would your life look like? Just think about this. If when you woke up in the morning, you said, now, how will I bring the gospel of Christ to somebody today? It might not be through, the most eloquent preaching or through high theological debate or something like that. It can be as simple as an act of love, an act of kindness, telling someone about Christ, a parent to a child, a friend to a friend, a coworker to a coworker. But how would your life change if you every morning felt, yes, I'm like one of these 72 who've been sent out on mission? I love the fact he sends them in pairs. It's very important. We do this work in relation to others. There's something I think repugnant to Christianity and the idea of a single person doing his or her work. There's a marvelous movie with Robert Duvall called The Apostle. It came out, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago now. Really good movie about this complex, conflicted man who was a preacher, but also a deeply flawed human being. And he does a lot of good things, but one of the signs that all is not well with him is he essentially baptizes himself and then sets out alone on what he construes to be his mission. That's repugnant to the gospel. Jesus sends them, the 72, but then he sends them 2 by 2 to have a companion in this work, someone with whom you can talk, someone who can see what you're doing and correct you, give you feedback, insight, someone with whom you can pray, someone with whom you can share bread, with whom you can laugh and cry. It's exceptionally important in the spiritual life. We don't do this alone. So think, everybody, not just on the grand scale, but your ordinary missionary work, with coworkers and with family and with friends and so on, that you're not doing it alone. You're not just on your own, but you're always in communion with someone else doing the same work. Just think of so many people across the ages. Benedict and Chrysostom, Jerome, Francis and Clare, Dominic, Mother Teresa, Ignatius, they all drew to themselves people. They might have begun, think of Ignatius beginning in that cave at Manresa, was kind of on his own, but for his great apostolic work, he gathered to himself this society of Jesus. Mother Teresa indeed started off more or less on her own, but very quickly, former students came to her, and her order grew and grew. Same with Francis. He begins in a kind of solitary attitude, but then very shortly, people come to him. The Lord sends us out 2 by 2 to do his work. Okay, let's keep listening to the Lord. The harvest is rich, but the workers are few. Therefore, ask the harvest master to send workers to his harvest. It's funny, everybody, but this is it's an occupational hazard in a way of spiritual people, religious people, is we start to think this is our project. So we get into it, whatever your work is, of teaching or catechizing or missionary work, evangelization work, caring for the poor, whatever it is. You start to think, this is my program, and I'm going to come up with my plans, and we'll have our meetings, and we'll determine what we're going to do. Okay in itself, but in the Bible, everybody, nothing great ever happens apart from prayer. Let me just say that again. Nothing great ever happens apart from prayer. Yes, plans and projects and all that, fine. But if and only if it is sustained by, animated by, backed up by prayer, ask the harvest master. I know this sounds maybe overly obvious, but even in pious parish settings with good, dedicated religious people, if you ask the simple question, well, have you prayed about this? Before your meeting, before your strategizing session, before you launch your program, did you pray about this? Did you ask the Lord of the harvest? I might have told you before this story, but I've always been impressed by it. The great Billy Graham, the evangelical preacher, always sent a team ahead of him a year in advance of one of his crusades in a great city. he'd send the team not to do logistical work, but to pray. Their whole job was to pray for the success of the mission. That's good. Ask the harvest master. So whatever you're doing in the church, pray, pray, pray. Okay, let's keep listening to our Lord. Do not carry a walking staff or traveling bag. Wear no sandals and greet no one along the way. There's just something about poverty and simplicity of life that makes you a more effective evangelist and missionary. Now, I say, look, a lot of my work is in evangelization. I say this, with a certain self-reproach. I mean, we're all sinners. I'm a sinner. But those who live a simple life, a life of poverty, I think have a greater efficaciousness when it comes to proclaiming the gospel. He has been so good here as Pope Francis, reminding us of this fact. I remember this was 2015. I'd just been named a bishop, and we were all in Washington, and the Pope was coming to visit. And so all the bishops were standing out on the front steps of St. Matthew Cathedral in Washington. And there's all these limousines and big fancy cars because politicians were there and so on. And then up comes this little dumpy car, and it was almost comical, like a clown car. And up it comes, and out of it comes the Pope. And to this day, that's many years ago, I remember the power of that symbolism. Somehow, when we denude ourselves of a lot of the goods of the world, we're not relying on that, but relying on God's providence. Somehow, we have a more effective evangelical power. So don't carry a walking staff or traveling bag. Wear no sandals. Strip yourself of some of the accoutrement of life, and you might find yourself relying more on God's providence. Now, notice a kind of flip side to that. The very next thing the Lord says, stay in the one house, eating and drinking what they have, for the laborer is worth his wage. So, yeah, poverty and simplicity of life, absolutely. But is there an obligation on the part of believers to support those who do the explicit work of the church? Those who are the preachers and the celebrators of the liturgy, and those who are caring for the poor in a formal way. Is the church on for supporting them? And I think the answer clearly is yes. The worker's worth his wage. Do we, now I'm speaking broadly, do we as a church really support the people who are involved most directly in the work of ministry and evangelization and care for the poor? Do we see this as kind of an extraneous thing? We might, throw a few dollars in the collection plate once in a while. Or do we see it as a basic work of justice? What we owe to those who are doing in a very explicit way the work of the church. So, yeah, poverty, simplicity of life, absolutely, but also the obligation of all the believers to support those who are doing this work. I know from many years of leadership in the church, we'd have nothing in terms of parishes, hospitals, schools, seminaries, institutions, were it not for the extraordinary generosity of lay people. Good, responding, I think, precisely to this, that the worker is worth his wage. Good, thank God for those generous people. Okay, just a few more. What should the minister do when he gets to the city? Jesus says, cure the sick there. Very interesting. Was Jesus a healer? Absolutely. One of the most basic things we know about him is that he healed the sick. He was called a soter. That's in the Greek of the New Testament. It means healer. Read Philip Jenkins. He does these marvelous books on the church in the developing countries. So we tend to read things through the Western lens all the time. But look at the church, especially in Africa. What does Jenkins notice? That the churches all have healing services. Not extraneous, not like, once every 6 months and a few people come. No, it's essential to the life of the church is that people come to be cured. Yeah, good. Have we lost confidence in that? Jesus said, go cure the sick. Now, healing takes place at many levels, of course, intellectual and spiritual and psychological, and the church does all of that. It's involved in healing, but I think also even in the most kind of direct way. Do we take that seriously? Or do we think, that's for, ages gone by? I don't know. He tells the 72, cure the sick where you go. And the church is still a source of that healing. How about one more? The second great task after curing the sick, Jesus says, is proclaim that the reign of God is at hand. Well, there's the central theme of his own preaching. When he first appeared in the hills of Galilee, that was what was on his lips, the reign of God. What does it mean? Oceans of ink have been spilled trying to explain the kingdom of God. Can I say this maybe? Jesus himself is the kingdom of God. That means he's the coming together of divinity and humanity. He's what a properly ordered humanity in relation to the infinitely loving God looks like. And therefore, the world that he opens up, that's the kingdom of God. Love and peace and forgiveness and nonviolence. Love especially of one's enemies. Think of the world in all of its manifestations of cruelty and hatred and injustice and violence and scapegoating and all of that. That's the kingdom of the world. Jesus, in his own person, is the reign of God. He's the kingdom of God. So what do we do as a church? We proclaim him. We announce him. We offer him to the world. And it's a challenge to the earthly kingdom that dominates our thinking and our behavior. Okay, so there you got it. Go back to Luke chapter 10. Review this gospel, fellow baptized people, and you'll see step by step what the church ought to look like, what the church ought to do. And God bless you.
Just great to have you in the studio. I really enjoyed your book. I think it's such an interesting kind of thesis about how to really read this idea of the nuns and the idea of non-religious society. And of course, Bishop Barron, always great to be with you. I thought maybe we could kind of just start the conversation by the idea of the thesis. You know, are we truly a secular society? Has religion really exited in the way that we understand it?
Sure. Well, without spoiling too much of the book, my answer is a sort of resoundingly no. And one of the reasons I wanted to write Strange Rites is to counter this notion that we live in whether we want to call it a secular age or a non-religious age or a godless age or any one of these ways of talking about the contemporary religious landscape that takes too seriously a piece of data which is, I think, significant, but often misinterpreted, and that's about religious affiliations. So when the idea that America is a sort of, and this is when the idea that contemporary America is a kind of secular environment, the same few statistics are trotted out about give or take a quarter of Americans say that they're religiously unaffiliated. The rise of the NONES, nuns, is another word that's often used. And that number, percentage does go up to about 36% among younger millennials and members of Generation Z. So based purely on these numbers, it's understandable to say, all right, are we looking at a group of people, particularly young people, that are moving away from religion? And the answer is kind of sort of yes and no. That what we're looking at is a decline in religious affiliation, in what the box you tick on a form is, but what we're not necessarily seeing is a move away from spirituality. What we're rather seeing is different ways of talking about religious and spiritual identity, and there's sort of two elements to that. And the first is that, of course, many of these people who see themselves as moving away from organized religion or institutional religion don't necessarily move away from belief in God or the divine more broadly. About 72% of self-declared religiously unaffiliated people say they do believe in some sort of higher power, and about 17% say they believe in the God of the Bible. I believe that's how the polling question puts it. So you have this group of people that do indeed have some kind of faith, perhaps even a faith that in some regards is similar to more orthodox understandings of religion, and yet don't belong to religious institution. The second element is that there are people, and I think that the polling is finding now, I think that the polling data is reflecting this more clearly, who might indeed at a certain point have put something on a form by default. No, I don't really believe this, but like, sure, I'm Christian, sure, I'm Episcopalian, sure, I'm Jewish. And that may not have reflected their personal beliefs. Indeed, among people who are affiliated, it still may not reflect their personal beliefs. But nevertheless, I think speaks to the fact that if we do want to talk about sort of our communities or ways in which we're part of certain rituals, religion is no longer necessarily one of those axes through which people find that, if indeed, I want to kind of challenge the framing of that, because I think to say, I don't necessarily think religion fulfills this need, and this need is ritual, and community is exactly the right way of going about it. But I think for people for whom this is a need to be filled, suddenly the actual religion element becomes obsolete. There are other avenues, other channels through which people find what they're looking for. And so we end up with a kind of more complicated picture of religion, rather than just saying, you tick this box on the form and this is what you believe, and this is sort of your avenue to a civic life, to certain kinds of sense of meaning, of purpose, of ritual and community. Instead, we're seeing people approach religion kind of much more individualistically as, how can I get my individual needs for meaning or purpose or ritual or community met? And the way that I want to approach this is by kind of mixing and matching, figuring out what works for me. This is sort of what I call religious remixing in Strange Rites. It's a sense of, how can I take a little from column A, a little from column B? Maybe I'm a religiously unaffiliated person on the form, but maybe I'm still Christian or Jewish on the form. But my daily life is a mix of, I get a sense of spiritual well-being from yoga, or I read tarot cards to get in touch with my subconscious, or I go to Soul Cycle every morning, and that's a kind of ritual that grounds me in a particular way. And increasingly, that tendency towards creating a bespoke spiritual life, to use that term, is the way in which particularly younger millennials and members of Generation Z tend to approach spirituality more broadly.
Yeah, and Bishop, you've been talking about the rise of the nuns and the need to reach them and better understand them. And so what did you kind of gain from this book here?
Yeah, a lot. And I say this first, that I was grateful for the way you complicated the question. I think that's a healthy thing. I'm a bishop of the church, so I'm concerned, obviously, about disaffiliation. And that's the correct way to name it. Having said that, it's good to look at the nuns in a more textured way and to see these religious instincts, I'd call them, or basic religious impulses still present. Now, we're left in a way with a kind of farrago of beliefs and practices, and some seem a little crazy, some seem halfway there, some seem fairly close to classical religion. And so the question I'm left with is, well, how do you decide? Is there any room for like real religious argument? Or are we left simply with, I got my point of view, you got your point of view, let's tolerate each other? So the question of truth kept striking me during the book. I'm glad that we complicate the discussion, and I'm glad we have something we can really appeal to. So a lot of religious leaders will say, oh gosh, the young people, they just hate religion, or they're just drifting away. Well, as you say, yes and no. And the good news about their not drifting away is we can find an avenue. We can find something we can hook onto, we can appeal to. So that, I think, is super important for religious leaders. I thought a lot too about Augustine, his distinction between religio and vera religio. So there's religion, and whether it's Augustine or Schleiermacher, there's these fundamental religious instincts, we'll call them. And they're real, they're part of our makeup. But then Augustine says there's true religion. There's the religion that, I would say, based upon revelation and speaks it focuses the religious impulse appropriately. How do we get at that? Because your book is so good at showing this sort of jungle of, complexity and all these different approaches, and this appeals to you and that appeals to you. But can we ever come to like Lonergan's moment of judgment? So there's all kinds of interesting things out there, but which one is at least relatively right? So that I kept coming back to that question of truth, of vera religio versus just religio. And is there any way in our present context that we can even have that conversation about religious truth? So anyway, that's what Many things struck me, but that was a key question.
I think perhaps it's the area I'm most pessimistic about when I look at these kind of what I call new religions. And I think that there is much to be, I don't necessarily critique them all equally, nor do I think that they're sort of all completely wrong, but I think that the one thing that is most difficult when, especially like coming from it as a Christian myself or as any kind of realist, is there really is no space for truth claims. And that's not just because we live in a pluralistic world and it's difficult to talk about truth in, while still having some sort of common ground. I think it's because a lot of, if there are implicit metaphysical assumptions made in a lot of these movements, they're about the primacy of the self and the self's ability to apprehend the divine or truth that are so I call them intuitionalist in my book, but they're so wedded in the sense that the self is the only authority that they're kind of allergic to truth claims in a particular way. And in my book I talk about the kind of historical genealogy of a lot of these contemporary movements. I see them as rooted particularly in romantic and transcendentalist philosophies of the 19th century. More importantly, I see them rooted in something called New Thought, which is the sort of 19th century The Secret self-help movement, but the kind of underlying argument is sort of if you positive thinking will bring you wealth, or positive thinking will bring you health, and if you just manifest it, it will come. And I think that implicitly these ideas of there being this kind of energy out there in the world that you can get in touch with by looking inward, by focusing on your own desires, whether it's the energy of a soul cycle class or it's manifesting the increasingly sort of popular action you can take, that's sort of the social media phenomenon of I'm just going to manifest this and make this true. The metaphysics of it are look within yourself, focus on your desires, and the universe out there kind of, it doesn't necessarily conform to it exactly, but your desires are the surest avenue to whatever's out there in such a way that I think trying to make truth claims, especially truth claims that don't feel good or feel right, is very difficult to do because you're kind of tripping over the fact that there is an implicit individualist metaphysic already there. So it's not, maybe the right way to put it is not necessarily that there is impossible to make truth claims, but that there's this one truth claim already implicit that with which other, often more orthodox ways of talking about God or ethics or really anything else are incompatible. And I think that's something that is often overlooked when we talk about these new religions, and there's so many different kinds, and it's a very varied landscape, which it is. But I do think that this is as close as you can find to a kind of unifying narrative in all of them.
No, I think that's right. And the thing about truth claims, though, is, willy-nilly we make them. They're inevitable. You have to. Even to say there's no truth is a truth claim, And so you say, well, this is my truth. Well, access to truth might be individual, but the range of truth, if it's truth, has to be universal. If it's true, it's true for everybody. The range of it, the access might be particular, through this particular culture and so on I came. But I want to ask you, why would people have such blithe confidence in the self? I certainly get the mistrust of institutions. There's plenty of reason to mistrust religious and cultural and political institutions. I get that. But why in the world would we say, therefore, I'll turn to the self, because the self obviously is infallible and perfect and morally upright in every way. Heck, I don't trust myself, that what I come up with, my own ideas, my own intuitions, I subject them, I hope, to criticism, and I'm very skeptical of them. What gives people such a blithe confidence that the self is the proper generator of truth and meaning?
I do think it's desperation. I think, as you say, it's, the mistrust of institutions, the mistrust, whether it's civic, journalistic, political, what have you. I think that's a big part of it, but I think more broadly, it's if you don't have anything else, if there is nothing else for you to trust, I do think it becomes more natural to say, well, at least, and this is the narrative I'm not don't necessarily agree with it, but like at least I'm not lying to myself. And of course, people do lie to themselves all the time. Oh yeah, but at least there's a sense of like, well, I guess if I'm lying to myself, I would know. But I think that there is an implicit dogma in a lot of this talk of the self, which is that the self, the true self, the authentic self, and I'm sort of putting air quotes around a lot of these words, is in some way infallible, pure, perfect, as close to God or the divine as you can get. And the thing that warps the self in a lot of these tellings or a lot of these narratives is other people, is the outside world, is society. There's a sort of strong kind of post-Emerson fear of society in there, where suddenly we are warped not by sin, not by kind of internal or personal failings, but by the ways in which society kind of pollutes and destroys us. And so suddenly it's repression is the source of evil, or desire for what someone else has as the source of evil. But even I think even then that former one is repression is much more given more weight. And so the narrative is less, well, you can trust yourself as you are right now, and more the more that you can cast off those elements of society that make you less authentically you, the things that repress you, the things that warp you, the pressures of other people, the bonds of family or even community, the more you can get in touch with who you really are, the more reliable you can be.
It's intensely interesting to me, all this stuff, because the claim that there's some kind of me, there's a real me or real self in there that's somehow independent of institution and culture and family and so on, is a complete illusion. I mean, all those things are fallen. I'd agree with that. I'm fallen, so is everything else in the world. But there's no I apart from all of that. I mean, I'm so conditioned by it. Even the fact that we're all speaking the English language now means that we're intensely conditioned by a whole received culture and manner of thinking and so on. You know, people say Descartes discovering the cogito. Yeah, but he spoke Latin to discover it, and that his discovery was conditioned in many ways by the structure of the Latin language. So that's my point about there's something so, to me, illusory and sort of quasi-Gnostic about that. There's the real me buried in here someplace, and I can just be freed from it. Or it's like Rousseau, that there's the poor, primitive kind of savage me, and then it's all these terrible societal things. But heck, the society from day one is always already conditioning me. And it's not to say the society's great. It's not. It's fallen. We're all fallen, individually and collectively. So I find that really interesting. It's a revival of an old idea that this pure, pristine self can be discovered apart from institutions and so on, and then can become the criterion for meaning and value. Heck, I would never want to give my little self that much authority, That's what I find intriguing here.
Something that I think is quite specific about this particular iteration, rather than, I don't know, maybe I have a softer spot for the Rousseau iteration, even as I disagree with it. But the thing that I find most troubling is the way in which this contemporary authentic self is increasingly identified with desire, or like what we want. And I'm not sort of limiting that to sexual desire or acquisitive desire or any particular object of that desire. But I think that the idea that what we are authentically can be understood through what we want is something that is, I won't say it's new, but I think we are culturally primed to have that be the emphasized element of who we are, or the emphasized constitutive element of who we are. I mean, even, I wake up, I check my email, I go online, and literally what I want to see is conditioning through various algorithms that are more complex than I dare try to unpack. What I see, what is offered to me, is just a physical, or at least a sort of digital manifestation of what I want. And I think that when we talk about authenticity, particularly in these sort of spaces or communities, whether it's talking about, finding your real self or your best self through, I keep going back to Soul Cycle, I don't make them out of me, through any exercise boutique fitness class, the narrative becomes this kind of slightly weird double movement, because it's both become authentic, who you really are, in a way that suggests a kind of natural primal state, but also at the same time, the narrative is one of self-making, of work on the self, of optimizing, and a certain kind of self-creation that I would argue the narrative is kind of you are who you want to be, and who you want to be is defined by what you want more broadly. And that double movement where the self is both a kind of innate, authentic thing to be always trusted, and yet also a commodity to be cultivated and burnished in a certain way and paid attention to. And for me, it's that sort of slightly uncanny and perhaps slightly oxymoronic double movement that makes me even more worried and I think even more critical, because simultaneously we are focusing purely on our desire, but also kind of not even able to access, even if there were some kind of authentic state. Clearly whatever we're doing is not getting us anywhere near that.
Yeah, two things. One, I'd be very interested to hear the term selfishness is maybe not the right term. So because I think part of it is if you're reacting against something that has failed you, whether it's an institution or your own family, or, I mean, religious communities are not very good at community these days, and so they're finding these rituals and communities and meaning in other ways. So oftentimes I hear the narrative that they're being selfish by doing these things. But how would you explain that narrative?
I'm wary of that language in part because I think if you're in a position to be kind of desperate enough to fall upon yourself, you've kind of already been deeply failed. I mean, I think it does make complete sense that, and I'm going to say this of myself, like if I didn't think I could trust anything, anybody, any community, any belief system, I probably would make that inward turn. Would it be selfish? Sure, but I don't necessarily like that language because it seems to kind of put more moral weight on the individual in the system, that they're just sort of deciding to do this because, I don't know, it's too hard to live a good communal life, which I don't think is what you're saying, but I worry that that's what the language of selfishness often implies. I think of it more as a kind of treating the self as a certain kind of fortress, that there's a retreat into the self, a retreat from the promise of community, the promise of embodiment, of being embedded within a world in which we are not self-makers or self-creators. Suddenly, that sort of inward retreat becomes a defensive posture rather than a kind of existential refusal of the good. That said, I do think selfishness as a quality that is fostered often in the language of self-care, it's often sort of prettied up, is actually, I think, increasingly understood as a virtue, and that's something different and something I do want to critique.
Yeah, I think also I immediately think of Eliot talking about the kind of breaking of the wholeness of reality, that something broke, now there's these little truths everywhere that people are seeking out, and I immediately also think, if I hear the terms authenticity or secular age, I think of Charles Taylor almost immediately. And I think that causes some individualism, that whenever that reality breaks, I mean, we're all kind of seeking something and we can't trust institutions and these things, that it's going to occur. But I'd be interested to hear what you think about Charles Taylor's work and how that holds up today.
You know, I thought of it too a lot, and you mentioned even that term, the secular age, which is his famous book, and I've talked a lot about the buffered self, his idea of a self that's cut off from any connection to the transcendent. And as I, went through this, again, farrago of examples that you give, I think some would confirm his thesis. In other words, if you think the ultimate reference in my life is making a better society, let's say you're a social justice, person, well, that's a secularist perspective. You're looking for meaning and purpose and all that within the confines of this world. Or you say it's just care of the self, it's making my body as healthy as possible. That's, I think, a secularist. But there are some of them that have at least the beginnings of, a reference to a real transcendent source of meaning and purpose, something beyond just our ordinary experience. And I think there are signs of it, there are indications of it. So it's a mix, I think. I want to go back for a second, too, to the institution individual thing. I thought a lot about Paul Tillich and just this natural play between what he calls dynamics and form. It's just the way all living things function. Without any dynamics or novelty and creativity, the animal will die or the plant will die. Without some formal structure, it will also collapse, And so that what life is a constant play between these two things. And so things like your term, intuition versus institution is a good example of that. Any religion will die without some kind of intuitional move. And, I'd say the great prophetic figures in our tradition represent that. But then without an institutional structure, it'll die too. And if we're just down on institutions and I'm for my intuitions, that's a program for collapse, and the same way the other one is. I'm all institution and I'm just down on experience and freedom. You're going to die too. You'll become petrified. As Newman said, too much St. Peter office makes you petrified. So it's the play of those two things. And I wonder if some of these forms that you're describing, that they're full of dynamics, they're full of intuition, and they've got to find some institutional mooring, or they won't survive. And can the traditional religions incorporate these two elements creatively? The image that came to my mind too, Jared, we talked about this, is the patristic idea of the two disciples running to the tomb on Easter morning. And John gets there first because John represents mysticism and intuition. And, he got there first. He believed, he figured it out. But then he waits for Peter, who's slower, to catch up. But then Peter kind of verifies, yes, this is true, So the fathers read that as the play between these two elements. And I think you got to have that in any religion if it's going to survive.
Yeah, and something also that I thought was very interesting, especially your distinction between what religion does versus what it actually is. And there was a question I had that when it comes to religions, going all the way back to the beginning with kind of the natural instinct towards religious desire, there's always this concern for the afterlife, of what's going to happen after we die. And something I didn't quite see in a lot of the kind of new religious experiences is any concern for that. Are you seeing that anywhere, or is that just something that's kind of on the back burner?
I think it is on the back burner. I think by and large, if there are sort of eschatological visions, as there is in sort of social justice, they are earthly in nature. And I think that even people who are, let's say, spiritual in other ways, or might understand themselves as spiritual but not religious, say, are more reticent, perhaps, to speculate about an afterlife beyond something between there's nothing and it's a mystery. I think that there isn't a kind of programmatic account of what happens after we die. And I think that death itself does become kind of very bizarrely overlooked in these narratives. That even, have you lived your best life? Can you die feeling that you've achieved what you want to achieve? Substitutes for a sense in which either death or what comes after death might be part of what it is to be human, or to have a certain kind of totality of human experience.
That's very interesting. I immediately think of some of the people I follow on Instagram, and most often it's, I don't want regrets on my deathbed. So I don't want to not have done things, but there's no talk of, but what about after? Another aspect that I just thought was fascinating was your indication that this is a uniquely American phenomenon. Maybe you could explain a little bit about that.
Sure. Maybe I'll walk it back. I think it's a distinctively American phenomenon, albeit one that is increasingly global, I think, as certain kind of American cultural influences are writ large. But I think that there's a very particular history to the sort of intuitionalist movement, as I've sort of said earlier, within the sort of wider pendulum swing that keeps happening in American religious history between the intuitional and the institutional, when you were talking about various great awakenings up to and including, the rise of Billy Graham and so forth. But I also think that the very particular contemporary iteration of it has been primarily defined by contemporary internet culture, which is not like specifically or uniquely American, but I think can be rooted in a largely American cultural rise. And I say in the book, and I do stand by this, that what the printed text was to, what the printing press rather was to the Protestant Reformation, the internet is to this new religious landscape. We are in a world where we are so used to kind of via algorithm, via our engagement with the internet landscape, taking control, ownership over our environment, of seeing environments presented to us, for us. That word bespoke or curation comes up again. And I think that model, a model that that model that I argue comes from as much from internet fandom as it does from any traditional religious form or practice, is what's really being democratized now. That this kind of fandom culture where we are consumers of a cultural property, that property in this case being various religious texts, and as consumers what we get to do is reimagine them and rewrite them and figure out what works for us and tell our own stories and kind of take a creative and agentic role in not just interpreting them but kind of re-narrating them. That I think is primarily American, particularly when sort of melded together with that sort of very distinctively American history of New Thought and a certain kind of Gilded Age faith that this kind of self-making would manifest naturally in health and wealth. But I am seeing it more and more elsewhere. I'm seeing wellness culture spread. I'm seeing modern witchcraft spread. But I do think that they're very much American at their root, even as, like lots of American cultural products, we are finding them more globally.
Didn't you point out that Jefferson himself might be the first one to do this, right? Yes. By cutting out what he didn't like in the Bible, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to get your take on this. Go back to biblical religion. It seems to me so much of biblical religion wants to unsettle the self. So even Moses, I'm going to go look and find out what this is. Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. The breakthrough of the divine into human experience that rearranges it, Isaiah's in the temple, then suddenly this vision that completely rearranges him, and then now send me, Lord, on mission. Jesus, the first words out of his mouth are repent, change. So as you were describing that, I was thinking that is a tendency today. Say, well, I want to make my life as agreeable to me as possible. So I'll rearrange things, I'll make all my choices online, I'll tailor this to my needs and desires. Biblical religion, the prophets and Jesus, they're trying to unsettle the self, and they're trying to remake it, but on God's terms, so that we become more in line with what God wants us to be. That could be a real point of demarcation, or a real point of struggle, between an excessively self-oriented, self-inventing sort of religion, and then whatever this other thing is, this biblical reality of God breaking into my life and changing me. I don't know. And the institutions at their best, the Christian institutions, are meant, I think, to bear that power into the world through our liturgy and through our teaching and through the saints and so on. Look how unsettling the saints are. Saints make us uncomfortable. I had that experience for me. Mother Teresa, Maximilian Kolbe. They don't suit me. They make me very uncomfortable, So I think that's fascinating. If people are being drawn so much into that space of, I'm going to tailor it to my needs, well, then biblical religion is going to be a real problem.
But something that it does offer, and I think that this is sort of at its best, is a kind of yardstick by which to interpret and discern discomfort, which is to say, if something makes me uncomfortable because I'm conscious of my need to repent, that's very different from something making me uncomfortable because I'm witnessing something like genuinely awful or wrong. And I think in the absence of, going back to our earlier conversation, robust truth claims or robust a sense of what the world is, what it's for, it's very difficult to discern, am I feeling uncomfortable because this thing that's making me feel uncomfortable should be making me uncomfortable because it's wrong and bad, and am I being made uncomfortable because this is out of my comfort zone in a certain way, but actually, yes, I should absolutely repent and give all my money to the poor. These are the psychological state of being ill at ease, or it can be fruitful and good and can be bad, and yet in the absence of any other criterion, it's absolutely impossible in this worldview to sort of tell the difference. I mean, I guess you could sort of work your way into, well, there's like different kinds of discomfort and some are good for you and some are bad, but it's extremely hard to, A, delineate those in a way that's communicable, and B, tell which one of them you're experiencing when in the moment, which, you know, even you can't really do, or is very difficult to do even if you do have all the yardsticks in front of you.
It's very good though, because you're implying that we need something like a yardstick or something like a truth claim, a moral or metaphysical, to make that determination. Like, okay, this is just a corrupt institution making me feel in a very illegitimate way uncomfortable. And that happens, God knows. That's what corruption means, right? Or this is the voice of God making me feel uncomfortable. And you're right. I mean, how do we make that determination? There's got to be some appeal to a criterion of truthfulness. But that's interesting to me.
Yeah, and something further in the strain of the fact that this is a particularly American phenomenon is the Protestant strain within the United States, as well as the transcendentalist and the spiritualist and the many others. But there's already a natural kind of individualism within the religious DNA of America. So is this kind of the pendulum swinging towards a more extreme version of that, perhaps?
Absolutely, and I do think that our cultural mistrust of religious authority or any authority, along with a sense that the best way to God or is a kind of personal relationship, and those things can be very theologically fruitful up to a point. But I do think that we are so unmoored from any robust sense of, I think, not just who God is, but I think perhaps something that could be more easily translatable to a quote-unquote secular person, like what we're for, what we are actually meant to be doing, and is there a purpose for us that is separate from the individualistic narrative of self-actualization. And there's just, in the absence of anything concrete to point to, or even, let's say, a wealth of concrete things to point to. I mean, we could talk about community, and we can talk about tradition more broadly. We can talk about biblical religion. And yet, I think because we culturally have moved to a position of being skittish about all of them, suddenly we're completely unmoored. And it is perfectly logical that we would end up with a kind of pure, self-actualizing, heavy intuitionalism, because there's just, it's internally consistent, if nothing else. And I think that's just what you get.
Interesting. I also thought it was the kind of history of the more Gnostic or transcendentalist or these others as kind of the strain of American religion. But I also was very interested to hear from you, Bishop Barron, about the influence of particularly Catholic immigration that comes along kind of right around a similar time where seances are occurring. You also have a huge immigration of Catholics, but they don't quite intertwine right away. They're still kind of like, we're Irish Catholics over here, and they're Anglo-Saxon Protestants over here. And so what starts to occur?
Strong institutional identity when the immigrants first came, and that lasts up until the mid-20th century. Really, I think in the Catholic context, till Vatican II. And then, people like Andrew Greeley traced that sociologically as Catholics moved out of a more kind of ghetto perspective. But there was a real institutional strength, I think of my parents' generation especially. And see, I would see that, God knows that institutional form was corrupt in different ways, but it gave them extraordinary strength and kind of moral purpose and identity. After the council, I think we tended to drift more into the standard American view, which is the self-actualizing, individual. And it's a loss. And I'm not just singing the praises of institutionalism, but there was a loss. My parents' generation had that in a way that we don't anymore. They had a sense of its meaning and purpose, but it came not from the self. It came from, I would call it the great tradition that was mediated through the institutions that they participated in. And I mourn the loss of that. I mean, even as I sing the praises too of real intuitionalism and the prophetic and all of that, and the need to critique institutions when appropriate. But I'm not enthusiastic about, let's just go the other stream of pure intuitionalism. I think that's a dead end. It's the Tillich thing again. My parents had something from that institutional side that was very liberating to them. The re-enchantment of institutions and laws, I think, is a desideratum. I really do. And again, it's not to valorize them one-sidedly, but to re-enchant them, that they brought something of great value, and just the way that, the law frees us, as anyone who swings a golf club knows, that the more you internalize the tradition of the game, the better a player you become, the freer you become. And I wonder if all this hostility toward institutions it's debilitating, because we're not taking in anymore some of this, call it legal structure, that actually liberates the self, Those are the sort of meta questions that I keep coming back to.
I'm always torn on that particular point, precisely because instinctively it is something that I think, it is good for people, particularly to be in community. And the more kind of formal structures that kind of get people in the door, the more freedom you have within it. Like, I think in terms of my own church, like, my sort of neighborhood church is often a place where I can just sort of meet people of all kinds of different demographics that I wouldn't otherwise come into contact with. People in their 80s, for example, because I'm not meeting them in a quote unquote affinity-based setting. There is a structure there, and yet I think where I'm reticent is not wanting to frame particularly religious institutions, particularly churches, as a source of this need that we have, because I worry about that framing causing the church to compete with other sources of community and meaning. And I always go back then to a data point I quote in the book, and it's particularly about Protestants, but it's about who is most likely to become a kind of spiritual but not religious person, or to move away from affiliation. And often it's not people for whom religion was. I think I had a stereotype perhaps coming into the project that people with raised in very conservative or very religious homes would be people who would rebel and leave. And it's actually people who are raised in homes where, like, you go for Christmas and Easter, like, you show up, it's what you do, family values, but you're not actually talking about faith. That those are the people who tend to move away. And I think that my interpretation of this is that if you grew up kind of, all right, we're Christian, whatever, that just means something nice for the holidays, or that just means something nice about community. Suddenly, community can be gotten more conveniently, perhaps more desirably, from somewhere else. Perhaps you don't have to get up quite so early on a Sunday. Perhaps you can go and hang out with more of your friends, and so on and so forth. And so I'm wary, even as I instinctively appreciate, certainly in my own church and more broadly, the power of an institution to provide that structure. I think that what you said about the enchantment of institutions, for me, that enchantment has to be just that this is true. And I don't think that there's any other kind of battlefield on which those of us who are defending certain churches can sort of fight, except that we think this is true. We can't offer let me think about a way to rephrase that. Sorry.
Sure.
We can't necessarily offer a convenient or a pleasant or like the best possible version of X, Y, and Z. It's just about, I think, is this true or if it's not. And that's sort of, so I think I've come round to that, even as I'm so conscious of the good that, in my own experience and more broadly, a robust church community can do. So it's sort of how do you hold those two things at once? How do you not cede the terms of community as a thing you can acquire from a good institution, while still holding up institutions as avenues for the kinds of communities that do make us better?
Isn't truth itself, in its objectivity, a ground for community? So if it's just my truth, your truth, her truth, his truth, well, we tolerate each other, and our community maybe is that, but we don't have real community because we don't share a common vision. When you have a common vision, you can really have a common life together. So it's easy to say with the institution and dogmas are bad and they're divisive, but actually they're at their best. They have a shadow side, I'll grant you that, but at their best, they're unitive, right? They draw people together into a common and shared vision. Something occurred to me when you were talking. It was the work of Christian Smith, at Notre Dame, who's done a lot of sociological research on the nuns and all that. He said one of the clearest indicators that a young person will not leave the church is that at the family table, they talked about religion. And that's really struck me. I think that's dead right, you know. Didn't mean they were indoctrinating or they're proselytizing. They talked about religion, which allowed them to get out of just a purely, hey, it's just my limited perspective, or I'm asserting myself. It's let's talk about it together. You're interested in Harry Potter, let's say, you know, and your stuff on that is so good and so illuminating. I think if a family were to say, yeah, you know, Harry Potter, a lot of those themes are deeply biblical. They're very much like the New Testament. And actually, you know, so-and-so is a Christ figure. And well, that's a healthy way to say, hey, I love your interest in Harry Potter. I think that's terrific. And it actually might bring you back to the text that underlies it, you know, namely the New Testament. That sort of conversation, I think, is a way to keep young people affiliated. And if we just allow all of us to drift in our own private conversations, you know, that's not as helpful.
Yeah, and actually, two things that kind of come to my mind. One is the danger, is in a lot of that you've mentioned in a lot of your work, is the Beijing of Christianity or the Beijing of Catholicism. Because what occurs is you end up with a kind of limitation towards just dogma, just structure, but not the aesthetic experience, not the cultural reality. So to rah and mystify that again, to give someone to look at, because I think with Soul Cycle and many of these others, there's an aesthetic quality to it that people can attach themselves to. So even being a vegan or being a CrossFit athlete or whatnot, it's an aesthetic reality that you're living in.
Let me just jump on that, because this is the side of me that really appreciates these different forms of religion, because we blew it. By we, I mean the institutional religions. I've been holding up the value of it, but in point of fact, in recent years, we've blown it in a number of ways. One is we dumbed it down, which I've been complaining about for years. We presented the faith in a very, frankly, stupid way, superficial way. But also we made it less than beautiful. You know, we muted the colors that are distinctive, and we didn't produce Gothic cathedrals. We didn't produce great music and great drama and so on. Well, people found it elsewhere. They looked away from the churches, which often became echoes of the flattened out secular society. And they found it in Harry Potter, and they find it in, you know, so many of these very, as you described them so well, these thickly textured, densely textured, often beautiful expressions. And that's a judgment on us, that we Beigeified our own operation, we dumbed down our own operation. Look at the Bible. I mean, if you draw people into the Bible, it will outdo Star Wars, it'll outdo Harry Potter, it'll in its weirdness and its strangeness and its glory and its weird characters, but we muted that. My generation, we didn't get the Bible. The Bible was turned into bromides about the moral life usually. But we didn't get the jungle and the texture of the Bible. So I say mea culpa here. I think we failed in many ways. And these other forms of religion, of course people found them attractive. Of course they did. You know? So we can learn a lot from that.
The other aspect, I think, is also the aesthetic quality that occurs in a lot of these other types of religions. That's another thing that got kind of pushed down, you know, the idea of fasting and the idea of a bodily reintegration of your religious beliefs. And so a lot of what happens, I immediately think of people who are paying money to experience the Navy SEALs BUDS program. I've talked to Navy SEALs that just thinks that's crazy, right? But there's that quality, even in Soul Cycle, of pushing yourself for something better that unfortunately a lot of the traditional religions have kind of nullified, or not nullified, but at least been quiet about.
Absolutely, and I think one of the interesting, bizarre things that Soul Cycle and places like it do effectively, if not exactly well, is they take something which I think is a genuine good or a genuine observation about who we are as human beings, which is that we want to be unsettled, as you put it, as we want to be rearranged or reshaped, and very cleverly mix it with this sort of vision of the best self as being like skinny, muscular, toned, looking a certain way. Suddenly you kind of get a 2-for-1 deal, where the sense of self-overcoming yields in this kind of setup a tangible, acceptable result for a different kind of image of the good. And so I think I'm harder on wellness culture than I am on a lot of other of these new religions in the book, because it is, the people who are making money off it, particularly because it becomes more centralized and more kind of embedded in particular corporations and institutions, it does become a way of like seeing the good and luring people in through the good, and then just completely changing its object to make it fully temporal. Because and I do think it means it's something very different to put your body through something for faith and to put your body through something if in the back of your mind you're thinking about how you're going to look on Instagram when you're done. And so I do think that wellness culture paradoxically does both, or it knows that people are willing to put themselves through all sorts of things and perhaps even want to put themselves through all sorts of things, but also that perhaps the people do not have faith that there is anything worth putting yourself through it for, except a certain visual image of yourself on the other side.
And I immediately think of, I had a pretty big conversion experience in Mexico City at the Shrine of Our Lady there, and I remember seeing young men with pictures of their mothers on their knees walking towards the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I mean, some of them had bleeding knees and this whole thing. And you can't help but be shaken by something like that, this biblical nature of just, it's not about me ultimately, and there's something higher than myself. But along with that was another really interesting part of your book in this kind of breakdown of the nuclear family and the idea that the social kind of pressure or the social acceptability of being religious or not. I thought it was an interesting kind of taking a look at how the nuclear family has just continued to decline as the norm. That when you don't experience that, to your point, when you don't experience that around the dinner table with your mother and father, and you have this sense of we're in this thing together and it's part of who I am as a Zimmer or whatever it might be, that there might be an easier route to just say, why should I associate myself with that?
And yeah, I mean, I think the irony of all of this is that I'm someone who's found, at least, I also sort of had an adult conversion experience. I was raised kind of Christmassy and Eastery Episcopalian and became a regular Sunday Episcopalian, I suppose, in adulthood. But something that I think that the church does well is kind of complicate and perhaps even invite beyond the nuclear family. It's a creation of a family that is, a table at which ideally all are welcome. And so I'm always, I understand, but yet I'm always wary at these sort of narratives of secularism that don't see the church at doing something at which it could be its best, to say, all right, perhaps we are in an era where the nuclear family is quote unquote broken, or where our knowledge of what biological families look like doesn't reflect the contemporary reality, and yet here is an institution who is literally, one of the things they do best is the creation of a family, and a creation of a family that does not necessarily rest on whether your parents stayed together when you got married or not. And it's an avenue that I would kind of love to see expanded, because it's certainly been a major part of my own experience as a Christian adult is gratitude for that.
Can I ask you, that's interesting, when you talk about your own conversion and entering more deeply into the Episcopal faith. If you're sitting down with someone who's like really into the Harry Potter religion, or they're really into social justice warfare and so on, and then that's really their ultimate concern, to use Paul Tillich's language, how would you, and I don't mean this to anyone in a negative sense, but how would you begin to argue with them, meaning to make a truth claim? I'm just curious. I mean, you who know so much about that world, you'd find, I'm sure, lots of points of contact, is my guess. But I'm just curious, how would you start to have that argument around the table to say, I've got something here that I really think is right and true, and I think you would find it right and true as well. How would you start that?
I mean, my narrative would be slightly different if I were talking to, let's say, someone really into Harry Potter and someone into social justice. I actually think conversations about social justice are often the most fruitful, and they're the places where there's most point of contact. Because I think one of the things I criticize most in my book are the more individualistic movements, the movements that are more concerned with personal attainment and self-making. And I think within the kind of broader umbrella of what we might call social justice, I think that there's a real passion and hunger for two things. One, for a collective kind of vision of a better world, but also a willingness, albeit in a vocabulary that is not necessarily the vocabulary I would use as a Christian, to talk about how are our perceptions warped? How are we broken? How do we perhaps not trust ourselves? And some of that might be through the fact that we've been warped by living in an unjust society. We've been warped by our position in that society and how it changes our cognition. But often that's a point where I'm like, this is, yes, I agree. Yes, that we can have a fruitful conversation about ways in which self-questioning and what we want or think what we want, or what we see versus what we think we see, have all been polluted and warped by, I think we could probably find a point of agreement and say, a sinful, warped, broken social system, and where exactly we put the emphasis on those words might differ. But I think that one of the kind of most fruitful avenues of conversation can be in a kind of solidarity of how do we agree that the way that we exist in the world is broken, and that a huge part of that is how each of us is able to see and experience what it is to be human. And the language, of course, of forgiveness, of redemption, of what you do about it. Perhaps there might be sources of disagreement, but I actually think that that's one of the easier conversations to have. The harder conversations, and I have this, probably more often actually, is with someone who's, let's say, really, really committed to the notion that personal freedom to do what you want with your body, with yourself, is the highest good. And these are not necessarily people who might even think of themselves as ideological or religious in a particular way. And I'm thinking of lots of friends of mine too. I live in New York. It's a pretty common sort of starting point. Is obviously the highest good is to do what you want and to be who you want to be. And anything that gets in the way of that is dangerous, suspicious, and wrong. And those are the conversations where I often, even if I let's say agree on the outcome of an issue we're discussing, but don't necessarily agree on the premise, I do find it harder to kind of find a point of commonality there. I don't actually think freedom is the highest good. That doesn't mean that I'm an authoritarian that thinks that all liberty is bad, or whatever caricature they might have of that would be, but simply that I'm expressing dubiousness about that is often the most difficult starting point for any conversation.
It's very close to my own instincts. I gave a talk to the bishops a couple years ago, sharing some of the stats about the unaffiliated, and then raising this issue of how would we both best approach them. And I said, look, the non-starter would be the church's sexual teaching. Young people hate it for the most part. I'm not commenting as truth or falsity. I'm just saying they don't like it. So I said to the bishops, I don't think beginning with those issues is the best way. But what they do like, I said, and that comes through in all the studies, they love our social justice tradition. And going back to the Hebrew prophets and the Jesus and the church fathers and up through Thomas Aquinas and the popes, and we have a very strong tradition. And then I think of someone like Tom Holland, not the kid that plays Spider-Man, but the historian, who argues, I think, very persuasively that what we take often for granted as general truths, in fact, have come from this great biblical tradition, and care for the poor and the marginalized. Ancient Romans weren't that concerned about that. Ancient Greeks weren't that concerned about it. It came in through the Christian, window. And so I told the bishops, I think starting with our social justice tradition might be the best way to enter into that argument. So my instincts are close to yours there.
Absolutely, and I do think that there are actually certain elements of, let's say, the church's sexual teaching that actually can be the source of fruitful conversations, which is to say, and there's a great book that just came out, Christine Emba's Rethinking Sex. My friend came out from Sentinel last month, and wonderful on this topic. But I think that, and I'm in New York. I have friends who probably are what someone might picture a bohemian New York artist to be. And yet often a point of commonality when we talk about sex and sexual issues is a real discomfort with a kind of Tinderization and of of sex, where even people who might have views that are not in accordance with the Catholic Church on, let's say, premarital sex, are still saying, you know what is what's really awful? Feeling dehumanized. When people dehumanize one another, feeling like this is a sexual marketplace and I have to be a 10 to compete. And certain conversations that I've had, both with Christian friends, but also with people who are, would say, I don't agree with anything about the church says about sex, are very interested in and happy with talking about, hey, how can we not treat people like objects? How can we treat each other in the image as human beings made in the image and likeness of God? And I've actually found more points of commonality rather than fewer. And in a way that's made me kind of think, all right, this is these are conversations we can have, and this doesn't necessarily have to be something I never talk about with certain friends.
And I think that it also expresses sort of the wisdom that Botilla and Maritain and many of them, that to start with anthropology, to start with what does it mean to be a human being, and to thrive as a human being, which is much of what these new religions are offering, of like, as a human being, you ought to be fit, you ought to be happy, you ought to be these things. So to start from that grounding where we can have a common basis to have these conversations with the desire of, I want you to be fully happy, I want you to thrive completely. That's a great place to start. I wanted to return a little bit to the fandom. I thought that's a very interesting kind of this like consumer creation or creator, is a very interesting thing, because I was thinking about how stories in the past, so going all the way back to the Iliad and all the way up to the Aeneid and many others, a lot of the inspiration that those stories were meant to give is, one, to inspire you to do great things, but in large part as a Greek or as a Roman, as participating in a larger story. And then the ultimate fulfillment of that, of course, is the gospel. This is the greatest possible theodrama that you can participate in. And so would you say that another part of what's occurring with either through Star Wars or these other kind of fandom ways of participating is a type of that, and perhaps that's another starting place for us to say, what you love here, it's even better over here?
I've never seen a Marvel movie, so I can't comment specifically. But I think that yes and no, which is to say, I think stories of heroism more broadly, or like great stories in general, are of course great starting points to talk about the virtues and ideas underlying them. But my concern is, and I have not watched Marvel movies, other franchises, I think this is also true of, that because things are designed for fans in a particular way, the sort of media ecosystem is as much about, getting that meme on Twitter of that shocking moment, or having the kind of, I can't believe that happened hashtag, or having fans respond in a particular way. Perhaps I'm idealistic and thinking that this is distinctive, and this is sort of always true of all forms of artistic production. But I think now the idea that media is made for the fans or for fan discourse actually means that we're less concerned with stories to stand as stories, and more interested in ways in which stories can kind of fulfill certain consumer impulses. And this, I think it's often called like fan service, is a sort of the fandom term for when something is kind of put in a show or a movie just to kind of have everybody scream in the theater when the character you thought was dead comes back, or your fan favorite has a particularly exciting and memeable moment. And I think then I'm actually much more wary of finding points of commonality by saying, yes, these stories are important, and these are stories about heroism in a particular way. Let's use this as an approach to talking about faith. Perhaps because I don't think I don't think art made in that way is particularly good, and I think it maybe even might take us away from the good. But maybe I'm just a snob about franchises more broadly. I'm wary. I guess I'll say I'm wary, and I'll talk about Harry Potter specifically, because that's I think that the themes of Harry Potter are sure general good versus evil stuff, and yet I don't necessarily think that the way in which it explores good or evil or sacrifice are even necessarily complex enough to kind of rise to the level of, I mean, they're perfectly decent conversation starter, but I wouldn't necessarily think that like my way to talk to someone who loves Harry Potter about theology would be to point to these characters as much as to kind of ask them what they're interested in more broadly, or what it is that touches them about this text or any other text, and go from there.
Can I stay with that for a second? Because it occurred to me a lot as I read the book. I kept asking myself, do these people really believe this stuff? Or is it a type of like role playing, or it's a type of transgressive play? For example, Harry Potter. So you say, okay, I get it. It's a great story, great characters, very successful book. But it's a children's book written 30 years ago or whatever it was. And do you really think this is your new sacred text? Do you really think this is what I want to base my life on? Or Star Wars. I have deep admiration for Star Wars. I go back to the first three and love them. And I get how kids will recite the entire Star Wars thing. They're really into it. But it's a movie made for teenagers. You know, it's a space fantasy for teenagers. Do people really believe this is what they should base? And I'll do one more example is the witches. You know, I think, okay, witches. So women who claim to be witches and they're calling a hex upon people they don't like. Do they really believe they have access to supernatural powers that can negatively influence their enemies? So I mean, to what degree is it just it's transgressive play rather than something serious? Is it religiously serious or more of a protest, or it's a playful protest against institutions? Talk about that.
So I'd separate then. I think I'd separate out Harry Potter fandom and witchcraft there, because I think they're two different phenomena. I think within Harry Potter fandom, my sense is that a lot of the closeness that people have to the text is partly it's, you know, given the age of people involved, that they might have read this text when they were younger, but often the closeness is as much to characters that feel like they've become theirs, that because of something like fan fiction, you might read a character that is, you know, reasonably interesting on the page of the original, but now you're reimagining that character, you're writing your own texts about that character, your friends, whether they're online or off, are writing texts about that character. Suddenly it's both communal and the characters sort of take on another life of their own, independent from the text. So I'm kind of inclined to say that the seriousness there is about the world, the characters, but not necessarily about the text of J.K. Rowling. And I think the fact that J.K. Rowling herself is increasingly less popular with her own one-time fans because of largely her views on transgender issues has made that even more clear. With witchcraft, I think people do believe it, but believe it in a very particular way, which is to say, going back to what I'd said earlier about the kind of metaphysics of energy. I think that there are people who say this is purely symbolic and this is just a political protest act, particularly after 2016 when the kind of witch imagery was seen as very much the way of getting back at Trump and the imagined like white Christian man who had voted for Trump. But I think that there are people who, on the other side of it, might be quite serious and say this is absolutely like this is magic and this is how the world works. And I'm 100% a witch and all in. And those are sort of the two spectrums. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. But I think more people do fall into this category of like, you're moving energy around in the universe and you're affecting the energy, and the energy is out there, and if you do these symbolic actions, you're kind of manifesting the energy of the universe in a certain way. So no, maybe you're not going to directly cause a air conditioner to fall on Brett Kavanaugh's head if you hex Brett Kavanaugh, but the energy out there in the world, which may or may not also be understood as like encouraging other people to vote, which is often sometimes brought up in these circles, or you're encouraging other people to protest, that somehow the energy of political action, the energy that's out there in the universe, all coincide together so that there's some kind of imagined outcome, like this is going to be bad for Brett Kavanaugh down the line if I hex him, but might not be because he slips on a banana peel.
Yeah, I mean, it's old stuff in a way. I mean, that goes back to the Gnostics, and it comes up in Star Wars, certainly the Force and all that, and you know the energy that runs through all things. And Joseph Campbell would talk about that. I mean, the zoom of what's he called, the zoom of being or something. So I get it. I mean, sure, that's there. I wonder if we can and how we should argue about it, like to engage someone. I would say, yes, that might be a way in to talking about a transcendent reality. But that's helpful, that distinction. Maybe there are people that believe in that sort of quasi-Gnostic form of spirituality, I suppose.
I think more and more people do. I think even among people who will talk about themselves or put the Christian down on the form. I think that it is more common than not that people I talk to will have, in addition to or instead of another kind of metaphysical system, some sense of this vague energy. And I'm one of my favorite, I think it was a Pew study, there's something like 30% of self-identified Christians, I want to say that they believe in physical, like spiritual energies located in objects.
And reincarnation too?
Reincarnation, yeah. Reincarnation was like 27%. It's in the book. I don't remember the exact number. But so clearly there are people who, sure, I'm Christian, but I also believe this other stuff. And even like anecdotally, the way people say like, oh, well, okay, I don't really believe in astrology, but like, it's kind of true. And I think that there is a kind of overlay of these metaphysical assumptions on all of us culturally, and on that most of us subscribe to. And even sometimes, like I can even feel myself sometimes thinking in that way, and kind of have to talk myself out of that way. That there is no, that bad energy out there in the universe doesn't exactly quite dovetail with my theological commitments. And yet I'm so used to speaking in that register, or I'm so used to other people speaking in that register, whether even if it's the kind of joking of like, that person has bad vibes. There's a way that we're used to talking and thinking about it that is, I think, culturally normative now.
Have you found people use the universe now a lot for God? Oh, the universe is against me, or the universe conspired to make this happen, And again, I think it is to some degree a function of our dumbing down our own very rich intellectual tradition. I was surprised in the Christian Smith surveys, the number of young Catholics who believe God is like a human being that lives in the sky. I mean, extraordinary that this thing you think, they got rid of that with Santa Claus, but yet these are young adults who are saying, well, I mean, I don't think that's a reasonable, well, yes, thank you, it's not a reasonable view, but no serious Catholic holds it, but a lot of them held it. And that's a function, again, I think, of our dumbing it down so much.
And towards the end of the book, I thought it was very interesting. You provide these kind of two doctrines, if you will, of a godless world. Of course, one being social justice that we've kind of touched on a little bit. Another one is kind of this technocracy, or this tech kind of transhumanism type of thing of, both of which I think, to use the term, immanentizing the eschaton, right? It's about the reality of the end is here. But I thought it was also interesting that you juxtapose that with this kind of rise or continuation of the Nietzschean, Darwinian reality. And my big question is, where is it going, and who's kind of gonna take the controls here?
Oh man, who am I rooting for, or who do I think will win? I think it's the techno-utopians are most likely to come out on top. I mean, I think that of the groups that I talk about in my book as these sort of three visions of coalescing around certain ideologies, the ones I call the atavists, the Nietzschean right, the social justice, broadly speaking, left, and these techno-utopians. It's the techno-utopians that are kind of least obvious as a group, in a sense, as a movement, and yet every time any of us picks up a phone, the way in which we're kind of trained into thinking about the world, about ourselves, about time, and optimizing ourselves, our time. Every time we use our phones, and I say this as someone who sometimes wishes I didn't use my phone so much, we are playing into a system that is designed to kind of intensify these existing cultural qualities and intensify these qualities in ourselves. I think that I'm curious what will happen with the sort of post-Nietzschean right. I think that they frame themselves more in opposition to the trends that I lay out in the book than in fact they are. I think they're as much manifestations as they are opponents. But I think that this kind of, at the end of the day, the obsession with a hierarchy and certain kinds of strength or primal masculine power that your, alt-right weightlifter is posting about on Twitter is not really so different, except in aesthetics and vibes, from the wellness culture of a, Gwyneth Paltrow goop worshipping, latte drinking Brooklyn equivalent. I think in both cases that there is sort of an obsession with certain kinds of self-optimization that is disguised as something else. And I think, again, that cult of self-optimization, the cult of I must be my best self, I must be my best self on these kind of earthly axes involving career and appearance, at the end of the day is the sort of secret ghost in the machine underlying all of these slightly more complicated mythos or slightly more complicated mythologies of restoration or return or liberation. At the end of the day, it's just about self-optimizing, and that is very much, I think, the techno-utopian drumbeat.
Can I ask you about Nietzsche? Because in an earlier, last season, we had Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen, who wrote a wonderful book called American Nietzsche. And I found myself just agreeing very much with the thesis that of all the 19th century philosophers, maybe he's the most influential on the contemporary scene. And what I find so intriguing, I want to get your reaction to this, is both left and right. It depends on what side of Nietzsche, because there is that kind of atavistic side of Nietzsche, and let's go back to the primal values and the Übermensch and all that stuff, and the kind of the proto-fascist kind of business. But the other side of Nietzsche is, we're beyond good and evil, and so it's up to it's the will to power, and you create yourself. And there you see the influence massively on people like Sartre and on Michel Foucault. And so there's Nietzsche confirming my intuition that he's the most influential figure, because both the extreme left and the extreme right claim him. I'm just curious your sense of Nietzsche there.
I absolutely agree. I remember my first day in grad school, I think it was, that my professor was studying theology, of course, and then my professor got up and said, you all think you're here to worry about Richard Dawkins. Well, you're not. There's one person you really have to worry about, and it's Nietzsche.
Oh, okay.
But I do think that the one thing that kind of, that he makes a lot of really, really compelling arguments that without Christian truth claims, it's very hard to reject, which is to say, if I as a Christian were wrong about everything to do with Christianity, I would probably find myself drawn into and convinced by Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And the only reason I'm not is because I believe the gospel.
Yeah.
And I do think that his account is, while not agreeing with it, extremely plausible and consistent. And I think McIntyre says the same thing as well in After Virtue, that is that sort of,
which makes him so compelling to so many people. Yeah.
And so I can completely see how he does have his finger on the pulse of let's say 99% of who we are, and it's just that the difference of that 1%, it's awfully it's awfully vast.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been a terrific conversation. Wonderful to have you here, Tara. And Bishop, I thought maybe just kind of give us some kind of final thoughts. What's going through your mind? Yeah, as we.
I love the conversation too, and I guess I keep coming back to those sort of master themes of truth claim and religious argument, and the difference between religion in the broad sense, religious impulse, and true religion. Religion as unsettling versus self-creating, and I guess I come back to all those as the things we have to talk about. But my final thought is that I found this book very hopeful for those of us in the religion business and in the evangelization business. That it's not just a desert landscape that we're facing. The nuns who have no religion. There's a lot of religion that's out there, and it's strange, and it's a little odd, and it's very quirky and very individual. But we got something to work with. We got some traction as we do our work of evangelization. Doesn't mean we just surrender to a relativism or anything goesism, but we can go out with a certain confidence, I think, to meet this strange culture. But it's finally a hopeful feeling I got from this book.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Tara. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
I'm glad it read as hopeful. I think sometimes I feel pessimistic and sometimes I feel more optimistic. So I'm glad to know the book ended on that I was feeling optimistic that day.
For me, it did.